Imagine being faced with a truth that changes everything you believed about the past. Celine Grant sees her perfect routine interrupted when a humble girl approaches her and reveals secrets she never imagined. This girl claims to know details of a deep pain that Celine has tried to forget, the daughter she thought she had lost. Driven by doubt and fear, Celine begins an intense search for answers, but each step brings her closer to a dangerous truth and to powerful people who want to hide this secret at any cost. If you like mystery and excitement, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a story. Enjoy. The day had started like any other in Celine Grant's meticulously organized life. She walked through the busy streets of Chicago towards her favorite coffee shop, a small refuge where, over the years, she had developed a kind of sacred routine. She always sat at the same table, by the window that overlooked the intersection of streets, and there, away from prying eyes, she allowed herself the rare luxury of a brief moment of calm before starting the day. Celine was a 35-year-old woman, known for her impeccable posture and irrefutable success in business. She exuded self-sufficiency and control, so much so that colleagues and employees rarely saw her without a serious, centered expression. But beneath this impeccable facade, there was a story that few knew. Celine had experienced a loss she could never forget. A wound that, even after so many years, still throbbed on the rare nights when silence reached her. She sat down and, while waiting for her coffee, opened a report that she needed to review before the business meeting that morning. She was concentrating on the pages, adjusting details in her mind, when she sensed a presence nearby. Someone was standing next to her. Celine raised her eyes in mild irritation, ready to dismiss whoever it was. But her hardened expression faltered when she came face to face with a small girl, with tousled brown hair and unusually bright eyes. The child looked to be perhaps 9 years old and wore a threadbare coat that seemed to have been borrowed from someone much bigger. She was visibly humble, but had an air of determination that contrasted with her fragile build. She was holding a basket full of sweets. "Madam," the girl murmured hesitantly but with a surprisingly firm voice. "Are you Celine Grant?" Celine, still surprised, took a few seconds to answer. She was used to being approached, but by adults, never by an unknown child. "Yes, it's me. What do you need?" she asked, already preparing to answer with disinterest. She assumed that the girl would offer her sweets or ask for a donation and thought she'd just give her some change to keep her going. The girl, however, seemed nervous, but resolute. She swallowed and leaned slightly towards Celine, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I need to talk to you. It's important. I think you're in danger." Celine frowned, perplexed by the warning. That sentence, even more so coming from a 9-year-old girl, seemed so out of place, so unreal, that she almost laughed, thinking it must be a joke. But something in the child's eyes, a kind of seriousness that reminded her of adults who have been through life, caught her attention. She felt the weight of that statement with a strange and disconcerting intensity. "What's it like?" she asked, her voice rigid but slightly shaky. The girl took a deep breath, as if to gather her courage, and then stared at Celine. I know things about your life, ma'am. I know that you had a daughter." Celine felt her body stiffen, as if she had been hit by an invisible blow. It had been so long since she had heard that word, daughter, that the mere sound brought back a wave of painful memories. Only one person had dared to broach the subject in recent years, and he was now far away, in a place where she had sworn never to return. But how did that girl know? She forced herself to take a deep breath, controlling the emotions that were beginning to bubble up inside her. She did her best to keep her voice firm, authoritative. "Who sent you here?" she asked, forcing a coolness that hid the slight tremor in her hand. "No one," the girl replied, with disarming honesty. "My name is Sophie, And I have dreams, I see things, and in my dreams I see you." The weight of those words seemed almost supernatural. Celine wanted to dismiss it as a childish invention, an unfounded joke. But Sophie continued, determined. "I know you think she's dead, your daughter, but it's not true. She's alive. When I saw you here, this message came to me. I needed to pass it on to you." Celine's mind was spinning in 1,000 directions. It was impossible. Her daughter was dead. She and Jordan had gone through that pain together, had faced the loss and the immense emptiness that the death of a child causes. This certainty, painful and irrevocable, was what had sustained them over the years, the only thing that had allowed her to move on. "You're wrong, child," she replied, trying to ignore the tightness in her chest, to ignore the doubts that were beginning to seep through like cracks in her controlled facade. That story doesn't make sense. Who told you that?" Sophie lowered her gaze, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped the loose jacket that wrapped around her. "I don't know how to explain it," she whispered. "I just know that if you don't protect yourself, they'll hurt you. I saw it." She leaned closer, and in a tone so low that only Celine could hear, murmured, "Find Jordan. I feel he can help you." Celine stepped back, instinctively moving away from the strange girl, but at the same time unable to look away. There was something on Sophie's face, a familiar, almost painful expression. Something that awakened memories and feelings in Celine that she had kept buried for so long. The cafe was all around them, full of people coming and going, oblivious to the intense and disconcerting moment that was unfolding there. Celine felt the warmth of the place, the sound of conversations, the sound of cups banging on tables, but everything seemed muffled, distant, as if the scene existed only between her and the girl in front of her. The reality around her seemed less concrete than the strange words, full of unbreakable certainty that Sophie uttered. If I accept what you're saying," she murmured, her voice breaking, "why do you want to help me? Who are you?" Sophie stared at her with eyes that seemed to carry an ancient sadness far beyond her years. "I don't know, ma'am. All I know is that I feel as if I already know you. I felt the need to come and talk to you. I don't know why." And then, before Celine could react, Sophie walked away, leaving a small sweet on the table. With one last look at Celine, she muttered, "Find Jordan. You need to find out the truth together," and she left, mingling with the crowd hurrying down the sidewalk. Celine, stunned, remained motionless, trying to take in what had just happened. She tried to push away the doubts, the discomfort, and the memories that refused to stay buried. But deep down, a decision was already beginning to form in her mind, something she had promised herself she would never do. The thought of seeing Jordan again made her uneasy. Celine had tried hard to put that chapter behind her, to hide what remained of the pain in layers of work and responsibilities. Jordan had been her great love, and the loss of her daughter had turned that deep bond into something impossible to sustain. They had tried to support each other, but in the end it was as if grief had built them up between walls. Each attempt to reconnect only brought the scars to the surface, until the silence between them became unbearable. On the way to Jordan's house, Celine felt her heart beating faster. It wasn't just Sophie's strange visit and her disturbing words, it was also her own decision to open the door, even for a brief moment, to a past that hurt her. The drive to the Logan Square neighborhood seemed longer than it should have been. The streets, the buildings, everything around her seemed darker, and she realized that the possibility of her daughter being alive, however absurd, brought with it a kind of fear she had never experienced before. When she arrived, she hesitated in front of the door. Jordan lived in a modest, discreet house. For Celine, this represented much more than a life choice. It was a reflection of what grief had done to him. With a mixture of fear and determination, she rang the doorbell and heard light footsteps on the other side. The door opened, revealing Jordan, who looked at her with surprise and a certain hesitation. "Celine?" he asked, clearly bewildered. It was as if the reunion was something so unlikely that he needed to confirm that he was actually standing in front of her. "Hi, Jordan," she replied, her voice soft but laden with a tension she couldn't disguise. Jordan stepped aside slightly, allowing her to enter. The interior was simple, arranged in a practical way. He offered her a chair on the small sofa in the living room and sat down in the armchair opposite, studying Celine's face carefully. She looked so different, more mature and contained, as if the years had transformed her into a more hardened version of who he had known. The traces of pain, however, were still there, hidden by a mask of professionalism. "I didn't expect to see you," he commented, breaking the silence that was beginning to get uncomfortable. How are you?" "I'm fine," she replied, trying to avoid the bitter tone. It wasn't an easy question to answer, considering the reason for his visit. "And you, Jordan? How have you been?" He shrugged, looking at the floor for a moment before raising his eyes again. "I'm taking it easy. Work, home, you know how it is. After everything that's happened, all that's left is to try and maintain some stability." Celine nodded, knowing full well what he meant. They had both survived in different ways. He in the quiet of his simple life, and she drowning in work. They exchanged a look that expressed much more than words, a silent understanding of what they had lost, and the emptiness that loss had left. Finally, Celine sighed, preparing to talk about what had really brought her there. "I know this may sound strange, but today a girl came to see me, a girl called Sophie. She said some things about our daughter." Jordan remained silent, but his expression changed, revealing a mixture of pain and surprise. Celine could see that he still felt it with an intensity that he tried to hide. Even though he tried to look skeptical, the glint in his eye denoted a cautious hope, an almost unconscious desire to believe what she was saying. "What kind of things?" he asked, his voice lower as if he didn't want to break the spell of that possibility. Celine hesitated, remembering Sophie's words. "She said that our daughter didn't die, that somehow she's still alive, and that we need to look for her together." Jordan let out a bitter laugh, but his gaze remained fixed on Celine. "Celine, you know we've looked into all this. We spent months looking for answers. We spoke to doctors, psychologists. They all said that what happened was a tragedy, but that there was nothing more to be done." "I know," she whispered, her voice laden with a deep sadness. "But this girl, Sophie, I don't know. She seemed very sincere about some kind of vision she was having, about our daughter, about both of us, about someone wanting to hurt us. And she said that you, specifically, could help me." Jordan closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to push the memories away, but his daughter's name, that name that was no longer spoken in his home, seemed to echo in his chest. He took a deep breath, the weight of the past showing on every line of his face. "So you're saying you want to investigate all this again? Revisit everything?" "Yes," Celine replied, more firmly than she herself had expected. Because I can't ignore the possibility, no matter how absurd it seems. And because, if our daughter is alive somewhere, Jordan, we need to find her." The silence between them was thick with memories and regrets. For Jordan, reliving it all was opening wounds that would never heal. Still, there was something about Celine's determination that moved him. He knew her well enough to know that if she had come to him, it was because she felt it really mattered. And perhaps, on some level, he also wanted to believe that fate was offering him a second chance to find his daughter. "All right," he murmured, after a long moment's thought. "I'll help you, Celine. We'll look into everything again." Celine nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. She knew that this path might lead nowhere, but at least she wouldn't be facing everything alone. The next morning, Celine and Jordan met at the hospital where their daughter had been born. Just entering the building brought back memories of that tragic night. The stuffy corridor, the doctor's hurried voices, the silence that followed the announcement that the baby had not survived. Celine could almost smell the hospital's characteristic odor, the one she associated with pain and emptiness. They started with the medical records. Even though years had passed, some documents were still on file. However, when they asked for the medical records, something disconcerted them. Certain records were missing. The most critical documents about their daughter's birth and death had simply disappeared, as if they had been erased. "It can't be," Celine whispered, trying to control her growing frustration. "These records have been archived for years. It doesn't make sense that they're gone." Jordan was as perplexed as she was. But as they went through other documents, they began to realize that someone had deliberately altered or removed essential information about their daughter's birth. This led them to a name that appeared in some of the notes: Victor Hathaway, the doctor who had led the birth. Celine remembered Victor, a serious and cold man who had broken the news of the death with an indifference that had bothered her at the time. His coldness now seemed to take on a more sinister tone, almost as if he had something to hide. "We need to talk to him," said Jordan, already deciding on the next step. He was involved that day. Maybe he knows something that hasn't been revealed yet. But finding Victor wouldn't be so simple. After leaving the hospital, they discovered that he had retired and moved to an isolated estate on the outskirts of the city, where he lived in seclusion. It would be difficult to convince him to talk, especially considering that any admission of guilt could implicate him in a serious crime. Celine felt her stomach turn with each new discovery. Every detail made the idea of Sophie more tangible, and this left her increasingly torn between hope and fear. The mystery deepened, but the possibility that they were getting closer to the truth kept her focused. With Victor's name as the main suspect, Celine and Jordan began to delve deeper into the investigation, but quickly realized that they were dealing with dangerous people. Anonymous phone calls and suspicious figures began to appear around their offices and homes. There were times when Celine felt a presence watching her, a constant feeling that they were always one step behind them, lurking, waiting for the right time to act. It was in the midst of this growing sense of danger that Celine decided to look for Sophie again. She needed to understand what this girl knew and how she could help them put the pieces of the puzzle together. She asked at the cafe where they had met, and the waitress gave her the address of the girl, who lived nearby. Grace, Sophie's adoptive mother, agreed to meet them in a discreet park on the outskirts of town. As soon as she saw Sophie, Celine felt an inexplicable tightness in her chest. There was something about Sophie that reminded her vaguely of her own childhood, something in her features that seemed familiar, even if unlikely. "Have you discovered anything?" Sophie asked, with the innocent tone of a child, but the dark, intense eyes of someone much older. Jordan nodded, exchanging a complicit glance with Celine. "I think we're getting closer to an answer. But we need your help, Sophie. Do you know anything else about this situation?" The girl hesitated, her eyes shining with a sadness that seemed too deep for someone so young. "Sometimes I dream about a place. It's dark, with people wearing doctor's clothes, but they're not there to help. I see a baby being taken away. They say it's for her own good, but there are lies. They don't want her family to find her." Celine's heart raced as she heard those words. Sophie's description was hauntingly similar to what she imagined of her daughter's disappearance. Just then, unknown men appeared in the distance, watching the group with fixed gazes. Grace, alarmed, grabbed Sophie's arm and cast a desperate glance at Celine and Jordan. "We need to go," Grace whispered, already pushing Sophie away. Before they could get away, the men started running towards the group, and Celine and Jordan acted instinctively, protecting Sophie and Grace. A tense chase unfolded through the park. But at the last moment, Jordan managed to call the police, who arrived in time to interrupt the criminal action. The next day, she and Jordan met up, and against all the painful memories it brought up, decided to investigate. Celine already knew a renowned private detective, Michael Reese, famous for his discretion and ability to deal with difficult and even dangerous cases. After hearing Celine and Jordan's story and suspicions, Reese accepted the case, despite the complexities involved. "We know that the doctor responsible was Victor Hathaway, but we need proof," began Reese, organizing the line of inquiry. "Let's leave no stone unturned." With Reese's help, Celine and Jordan also took the case to the police, presenting a summary of what they had discovered so far. A girl who claimed that her daughter was alive, the absence of medical records at the hospital, and the suspicious behavior of Victor, the doctor who had attended her on the day of the birth. The first point investigated was the hospital where the daughter was born. Michael Reese used his connections to gain access to old medical records, which Celine and Jordan were unable to access on their own. After a few days of research and a generous sum for discreet bribes, Reese obtained documents that were essential to understanding what had really happened. In Celine's medical records, there was the birth of her daughter and a note about serious complications, but soon afterwards, the record was mysteriously interrupted. Instead of any indication of a death, the document ended abruptly, without the usual signatures or medical certificates. "This kind of gap in an official document is extremely suspicious," Reese informed Celine and Jordan after meeting them in his office. "The only reason this could have been done is that someone intentionally withheld these records, and if that happened, it means that there was probably deliberate manipulation." In addition, the detective found an entry in the hospital's record system under the name of Victor Hathaway, who had authorized the release of a special condition patient. The unusual terminology caught Reese's attention and indicated a secretive move that was not part of standard medical protocol. As the days passed, Reese deepened his research into Victor Hathaway. With the help of security contacts and some confidentially acquired information, he discovered that Victor had a close relationship with Charles Hartman, a well-known investor and former associate of Celine. The connections between Hartman and Victor raised even greater suspicions. Investigating their financial past, Reese discovered that Victor had, years earlier, received a large sum of money from Hartman's satellite company, known for making payments to external consultants. This money had been deposited in Victor's personal account shortly before the birth of Celine and Jordan's daughter. Financial analysis showed that the transaction was unusual by Victor's standards, indicating that he had been paid for something very specific, something that Reese concluded was the disappearance of the child. Reese also discovered that Hartman and other investors at the time of the birth had significant interests in Celine's company. There were documents indicating secret meetings between them, where they discussed how to manage the problem that the pregnancy could represent for the group's interests. One internal memo said, "Avoid distractions and preserve control of all stakeholders." These documents were important evidence that Victor Hathaway and the investors did indeed have a premeditated plan. With the new evidence, Reese contacted the police to move forward with a formal investigation. Celine and Jordan were summoned to testify as victims of a possible kidnapping. Initially, the authorities were skeptical, given the complexity and the length of time that had passed, but the financial evidence and the history of manipulating hospital records were strong enough to justify opening an investigation. The police launched an undercover operation where they followed Victor Hathaway's footsteps. They monitored him and intercepted communications, expecting him to communicate with Charles Hartman or others involved in the scheme. The intention was to gather enough evidence for an arrest and then coerce him into revealing the whereabouts of Celine and Jordan's missing daughter, During this phase, the police and Reese kept Jordan and Celine informed. The two were given protection, but lived with the constant feeling of being watched and stalked. With each new detail revealed, Celine felt the weight of the lies she had carried for so many years and the almost uncontrollable urge to directly confront those who had destroyed her family. After weeks of investigation and surveillance, the police and Reese got a hot lead. Victor Hathaway, feeling threatened by the surveillance, tried to contact Charles Hartman, but was constantly thwarted by the police presence. However, the wiretaps revealed a crucial conversation between Victor and a third party. During an intercepted call, Victor was heard saying, "We need to sort this out before they find out. Charles can't allow this to come to light." These words, combined with the evidence gathered so far, were enough for the police to issue a preventive arrest order against Victor, arguing that he posed a flight risk and could obstruct justice. Victor was arrested at the house where he was hiding, looking panicked when he saw the police at his door. Under pressure from the authorities, he was taken to the police station and informed of the evidence against him, including suspicious financial transactions and the manipulation of hospital records. Pressured by his lawyers and faced with the evidence, he finally began to confess his role in the kidnapping. After hours of resistance, Victor, exhausted and unable to deny what he had done, began to tell what really happened that night. "Do you want to know the truth?" he asked, his voice lower and more restrained, but with a slight tremble that indicated his suppressed nervousness. "Then tell me, how much are you willing to sacrifice to find out?" Celine and Jordan looked at each other, both eyes shining with determination. "Whatever it takes," Jordan replied without hesitation. "If our daughter if she's still alive, we want to know where she is. We want to understand what happened." Victor gave a bitter smile, his gaze empty and tired. It was clear that he didn't want to reopen the story, but he seemed to understand that he had no choice. "Very well, you need to know that none of it was simple. What I did on orders. Orders from people who had a lot more power than you realize." Celine felt her body stiffen. For a moment, her breathing quickened, and the room seemed to contract around her. Victor was about to confess what she had feared for years, that there was a hidden truth, a conspiracy that justified the lack of answers and the erased documents. "What did you do?" she whispered, dreading the answer. Victor looked away for a moment, as if seeking the strength to continue. "You two, Celine and Jordan, made powerful enemies. At the time, your company, Celine, was associated with a large conglomerate, and some of its partners had a lot to lose. When you and Jordan decided to have a daughter, some people thought it would complicate the control you exercised over your lives. They didn't want your relationship to continue, let alone be a family." Celine's blood ran cold. Victor's words were like daggers, revealing a plot she had never imagined. She tried to process what she was hearing, but each sentence threw her into a twisted, perverse reality. "Wait, are you saying that our daughter was taken from us for business reasons? That they made her disappear to manipulate our lives?" Jordan raised his voice, shock mixed with growing anger. Victor nodded, clasping his hands together as if to anchor himself to that painful confession. "Yes. I was instructed to make you believe that the girl died shortly after birth. I was paid to do it, and believe me, the amount I was offered was unreasonable." He looked at the floor, as if ashamed of his own confession. "But there was a complication." Celine felt her heart race. "What complication?" Victor hesitated before continuing. "I did what I was told. I declared the death and used my contacts to hide the records, but at the last minute, I couldn't do what they asked. I couldn't end her life, and so I gave her to someone who would protect her." Jordan stepped forward, his fists clenched. Victor's revelation left him on the verge of a breakdown. "What do you mean?" Are you saying that our daughter was handed over to someone else? Who? Victor raised his head, meeting Celine and Jordan's gaze with an expression tinged with remorse. She was given to Grace Lambert, a young nurse at the time, who agreed to look after the girl in secret. Grace had lost her own daughter shortly before that and accepted the task, promising never to speak of it. Celine felt a wave of shock and disbelief mixed with what seemed to be a spark of hope. Grace was Sophie's adoptive mother. Celine closed her eyes, breathing deeply as she tried to process the complexity of the situation. Each piece of the puzzle was beginning to fit together. "So, Sophie is our daughter," she murmured, her voice barely coming out. Victor nodded, confirming what Celine hardly dared to believe. "Victor," began Celine, holding back tears, but her voice trembling with anguish and indignation. "You didn't just separate us from our daughter. You made us live with a lie. Because of a man, a company." He lowered his head, the guilt and weight of past decisions finally showing on his scarred face. "Yes, and I'm sorry." The silence that followed was overwhelming, everyone absorbing the enormity of the truth. But before Celine or Jordan could react, investigators entered the room, informing them that Charles Hartman and others involved were already under surveillance and that arrest orders were in the works. That same evening, the authorities moved quickly. With Victor's statements and the evidence gathered, they went after Charles and the other board members who had planned the kidnapping. Celine and Jordan were informed of every detail. Charles' lawyers tried to block the order, but the investigation was too solid to ignore. The next morning, Celine and Jordan were called to a final meeting with Charles, who was already in custody, about to be transferred. He had been captured in one of his mansions, surrounded by security guards, and had given himself up without resistance, although he maintained the haughty and impassive posture he had always carried. As she entered the room where Charles was being held, Celine felt a mixture of anger and triumph. The man who had ruined her family was finally at the mercy of justice. She and Jordan stood before him, watching him with the firmness of those who know they have won, even after so many years of pain. "So," Celine began with a firm, defiant gaze, "is that what you wanted? To destroy a family, to make us suffer, all so that you and your friends could maintain control over a company, over a name?" Charles watched her with a slightly cynical smile, his face rigid and without a trace of remorse. "You've always been naive, Celine," he replied, his voice low and calculated. "Business is not for the faint-hearted. You two have become a problem, and problems need to be solved. I'd do it all over again." Jordan took a step forward, his fists clenched in anger, but Celine put her hand on his arm, signaling that he shouldn't lose his temper. "Just know, Charles," said Celine with icy calm, "that I too would do it all over again to protect my daughter, and now you're the one who's ruined." Charles watched her in silence, realizing for the first time the abyss that had opened up beneath his feet. He knew that everything he had built, all the plots and lies, were about to disintegrate before his eyes. In the days that followed, Celine and Jordan still absorbed the depth of the traumas they had suffered. Now, the arrest of Charles and his accomplices offered a real chance to rebuild what they had lost. For the first time, they were free to start again. The moment of the official reunion with Sophie arrived a few days later. With Grace's help, they organized a meeting at her house, a place that was familiar to Sophie and where she would feel safe. When they arrived, Celine felt her heart beating strongly in her chest, and Jordan held her hand, offering the silent support they both needed. Sophie was waiting for them in the living room, sitting next to Grace, her eyes shining with anticipation and her hands trembling slightly. She knew that something profound was about to be revealed, but she couldn't imagine the full extent of the truth. Celine knelt down in front of her daughter, her eyes watering and her voice choked with emotion. "Sophie, We have something very important to tell you." Sophie looked at her, her eyebrows slightly furrowed in curiosity and anticipation. "Jordan and I are your biological parents. You were taken from us when you were still a baby, and we've only just discovered the truth. Thanks to Grace, you were safe, and now, finally, we're together." Sophie opened her mouth in shock, trying to process the words, and soon tears started rolling down her face. She looked at Grace, who nodded with an emotional look on her face. "It's true, Sophie," Grace said, her voice soft. "I always knew, but I did what I thought was best to protect you. But now you have your mother and father back." Celine said, "Sophie, there hasn't been a day since you were born that we haven't missed you, even without knowing what really happened." With her face bathed in tears, Sophie threw herself into Celine's arms, while Jordan knelt beside them, wrapping them in a tight embrace. Time seemed to stand still, and the emptiness of years apart was filled by the connection that had finally been restored. In the months that followed, Celine and Jordan dedicated themselves to rebuilding their bond with Sophie. Grace remained by the girl's side as a mother figure, and together they all found a way to share that love, to share responsibility for Sophie, whose unusual gift of sight helped her connect even more with her birth mother. The experience would mark everyone's life, but especially Sophie's, who, with the help of her family, learned to better control and understand her gifts. And so a new family, born of truth, forgiveness and love, grew stronger with each passing day. 7 years have passed since that exciting and unexpected meeting. The lives of Celine, Jordan, Sophie and Grace have changed in profound and permanent ways. The reunion brought challenges and healing that each of them needed, but it also paved the way for new hope. On a sunny Sunday morning, Celine was busy preparing for Sophie's 16th birthday. The house they now shared was decorated simply, but full of lovingly chosen details: balloons in shades of blue and white, photos of Sophie over the years, and white flowers in delicate arrangements, just the way she liked them. The last few years hadn't been easy for Celine and Jordan. Adjusting to Sophie's return, now officially recognized as their daughter, brought moments of doubt and insecurity. They learned to deal with her adolescence, with the personality traits that emerged, and with the emotional impact of such a unique story. But in an almost magical way, Sophie transformed them. The bond between them grew stronger, and over time, the love that had once united them was rediscovered. Grace, who had helped them cope with the complexity of the situation, had become a constant presence and loved by everyone. Although Sophie was Celine and Jordan's biological daughter, Grace remained their adoptive mother, a figure of wisdom and comfort whom they all trusted. She had, after all, been the only family Sophie had known growing up, and now she was part of their lives as a link between past and present. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, guests began to arrive for the party. The garden was full of Sophie's friends and some family members who, over the years, had also been involved in the history of that peculiar family. However, Sophie was no ordinary girl. Since reuniting with her birth parents, she had learned to deal with her psychic gifts in a more controlled way. Her dreams, which had previously been confused and disorganized, became clearer, and she began to understand better what they meant and how to interpret them. Now more mature, she used this gift to help people close to her solve small mysteries and conflicts. This was something that Celine and Jordan feared at first, but ended up accepting with pride and support what made Sophie special. When the party was in full swing, Celine, who had been watching from afar, felt overwhelmed by a wave of gratitude. The pain and suffering they had endured over the years finally seemed to justify something greater, something beautiful and lasting. Next to her, Jordan entwined his hand in hers, and the two shared a look that said more than any words could. They were together, and the love that had once united them was there, stronger than ever. Sophie, for her part, was radiant. Her eyes sparkled with the typical joy of youth, but there was also a maturity in her expression, an understanding that went beyond her 16 years. It was the fruit of difficult years, unraveled mysteries, and unusual abilities that made her see the world in a way that others rarely understood. For a brief moment, Sophie turned away from her friends and walked over to her parents and Grace, who were chatting in the garden. She watched them fondly and, with a shy smile, approached them. It was as if she wanted to express something, a gratitude that went beyond words. With tears in their eyes, the four of them hugged each other, joining in that moment of celebration and love. At the end of the day, when everyone had left, the family stayed in the garden, under the starry sky. Sophie looked up at the stars and, as she did in her moments of introspection, said softly, "Thank you for finding me, for protecting me, and for accepting me as I am." Grace, her eyes shining with pride, put her arm around Sophie. "We're your family, Sophie, and we'll always be here." Celine and Jordan, side by side, knew that this young girl, full of gifts and quirks, was the embodiment of the miracle they had been searching for so many years. Sophie was the chance to start over, to overcome. She was the link that had brought them back together and given them the strength to face the past. With their hearts full, they watched the starry night, reflecting on everything they had been through. And so the story of that family, marked by pain, separation, and mystery, ended serenely, with the reunion and forgiveness that only true love can offer. Thank you for sharing this moment with us. Every story I tell is made with dedication and affection, with the aim of touching the hearts of those who hear it. If this narrative has awakened something in you, please consider signing up so that we can continue together on this journey of telling stories that move. Your support is essential if we are to continue sharing these unique experiences. Cheers, and we'll see you in the next story.